Religious traditions are often misunderstood as clearly bounded, static objects. We often make broad generalizations about the beliefs and practices of an entire faith community, as though every Jew, or Buddhist, or Muslim, or what have you, thinks and acts just like every other. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, there is extraordinary diversity and dynamic change within all religions. Every faith tradition consists of overlapping sub-traditions. Every faith community includes differing interpretations of tradition, as well as differences tied to social identities like race and gender. At the Religious Worlds of New York Summer Institute for Teachers, faith leaders discussed the diversity within their traditions and communities. As the following reflections show, there's no one way to be a Jew or to engage with Jewish traditions. There's no one way to be a Buddhist or to live by the Buddha's teachings. There's no one way to be a Muslim or a member of any other faith tradition.
I think one of the things that also merits conversation is that the vocabulary that Jews use around practice and belief and belonging tends to be very different than that of other religious traditions. And like even Judaism as a faith per se, we are a polythetic group of people with a lot of things that bring us together. We have a history. We have not just one, but multiple languages connected to Hebrew in one form or fashion. We have so much that brings us together and so many different ways of being Jewish that even vocabulary that is common about how people refer to us can be quite limiting and at times uncomfortable. And it places us in a funny dilemma when someone says, well, in the Jewish faith, what do you say? And I'm like, And the other one that is very common is what does Judaism say? And I'm like, Judaism is a giant conversation over multiple millennia from before the Bronze Age to the present. So Judaism says a lot of stuff about a lot of topics, and only in certain cases is there agreement about what we as a whole ought to say. And even that is with caveats and footnotes.
And so, as mentioned, I'm not here to speak for the entire JOC community. My experience as being a Black Jew is also very different, even than other Jews of color in different groups. But there are a couple of data points that I can share with everyone. I think that what happens is that it's shocking to know and to learn how many Jews of color there are. This number has increased since 2017 when the first survey was done, but there are approximately 1 out of 7 Jews in North America identify as Jews of color. And so that can be shocking because if you walk into a synagogue, by and large, you're not going to see those numbers. And so the questions are, if there are so many folks who identify as Jewish, then how is it that we've never seen them? Because when you think about those numbers, it really does, the math could work out that, you know, in a minyan, there should be a Jew of color, but that's not what we see. And a lot of times it's because there's harm done. And so when folks go into a community and they have certain experiences, they're less likely to return to that community. They're more likely to make decisions where they're not going to send their kids to day schools or Hebrew schools. And so that is part of what I am aiming to do and the work that I do. But you would be surprised, perhaps, that of those folks who identify as Jews of color, approximately 2/3 of them have at least one Jewish parent, because I think another assumption is that all Jews of color have converted. And that is not true. And not everybody has a conversion story. And I think that everyone on this panel can attest to the fact that almost every Jew has some sort of a Jewish journey.
Okay, so I am ordained and St. Luke's monk in the White Palm lineage, which is an American Zen lineage that started in 1979 jointly by a Japanese Zen master, Rashid, and an American Zen master, Bernard Rashid. We have a small community, about 24 of us that we regularly live in Queens, New York. And I caught the end of Dr. Hunter's talk, and I'm glad that she introduced you to the topic of the idea of there being two streams of Buddhism in America today. And roughly, I don't know how she identified them, but roughly we could talk about them as heritage Buddhists and cognitive Buddhists. And it's an overgeneralization, but I think it's still useful. And when you look at the most American Buddhists are heritage Buddhists. About 3.9 million Buddhists in America. 3.1 million are heritage Buddhists, and about 800,000 are cognitive Buddhists. But when you look at the heritage Buddhist communities, they're largely organized along ethnic lines. So you have Korean churches and temples, and Vietnamese temples, and Lao temples, and Thai temples, and so forth. And they serve largely first, second, and third generation immigrant communities that come to these centers as families, grandparents, and parents, and children and grandchildren. And these temples often serve not only religious purposes, but cultural and social purposes as well, so that they help in the transmission and continuation of culture, the maintenance of that culture. It allows people with similar values and similar culture to get together and associate together. It allows a place for children to be educated in the same tradition. So there are all these other functions in addition to religious and ritual ones and so forth. It's very different in the American convert community. This is a community that's made up largely of European descent, middle-aged, middle-class convicts. I mean, it's not entirely so. We have Chinese members of our community, and Iranian members, and South Asian, African-American, Latino members come through, but it's predominantly Caucasian. They have left, or at least they're dissatisfied with the heritage they were raised in, and they're seeking something else from somewhere else. So they're not seeking to preserve the tradition that they grew up in. So it's a very, very different community with different kinds of needs. Tend to be very individualistic. They also tend often to be steeped in Western philosophical tradition, Western scientific tradition, naturalism, materialism. So they tend to be skeptical about things like reincarnation. They're not coming to Buddhism to end rebirth or to again obtain a better rebirth, but they're looking about how can I maximize this one life that I know I have and make it as decent and honorable and happy as it can be.
Difference doesn't necessarily mean division, right? And he used the example of roses, and I think we're still privileging roses in equating it with flowers. What about peonies? What about African violets? Right? These are all flowers as well. And so if we say flower, what do we mean? How do we privilege certain understandings of flower if we just say flower? In the same way, when we say American, how are we privileging certain conceptions of race and gender and sexuality? Because if you don't think that it's implying certain things, then why do we talk about African American, Hispanic American, Asian American, right? Because there are very important ways in which single word nouns, particularly in the context of the US, are really expressions of power and privilege. And so to even say Muslim inherently erases marginalized Muslim identities, in my opinion, whether that's Shi'i identities, whether it's Ahmadi identities, and particularly again in the context of the US, there is a homogenizing trend. And there is a way to say, oh, if we just say Muslim, well, all our history books are all about Sunni Islam. Hey, I have no problem talking about Sunni Islam. I'm Shia. I'm proud of it. I will always identify myself as Shia. I have no problem saying, we've got 10 minutes, we need to talk about Sunni Islam. That's 85% of the Muslim population. Good, fine. And it's an intentional decision, right? When it becomes a default position is when it becomes problematic, because then you are erasing my identity. And you're making sure that you will always create the homogenized Muslim identity. Because the only way you can challenge, in my opinion, the idea of a monolithic Muslim identity is actually teaching the difference of what it means to be Muslim. Because otherwise, Muslim only means one thing, and that means whatever the person in power wants it to mean, and that means all Muslims are terrorists, and we'll never move beyond that. Unless you can talk about being Sunni and Shia are different. Being a Sunni Muslim from New York is different than being a Sunni Muslim from Chicago. Let alone, my family's from Tanzania, my friend's family is from Pakistan, right? That's very different as well, even though we're both Shia. Right? what does that mean and what does that look like? And so that specificity is actually how you start breaking down some of these homogenizing impulses.